terrific talk and certainly thought-provoking. Yes, go ahead. I'll fiddle around with this.
So, as you may recall, we had refreshments earlier today. We will have refreshments between the second and third papers. So, I believe it will just be drinks at the back of the room.
I forgot the dessert last night, so it's also other things too.
I'm sorry?
They forgot the dessert last night at the reception, so...
Oh, so there's dessert as well.
Dessert.
How lovely.
Excellent.
Yes, and so we will have a mini break, which means that we have to be very prompt with these schedules. And I'm going to be run out of town if I don't thank the kind sponsors for this event. In addition to the zillions of sponsors upstairs for the exhibition. The Oregon Humanities Center, the Departments of Architecture, the Department of Art, and separate from that,
Art history.
and Art History, and the Dean of AAA were incredibly generous in supporting this event. So,
our next speaker, Jessica Maier, is a scholar of Renaissance print culture, early modern cartography, and the representation of the city of Rome. She has a PhD in the history of art from Columbia University, where she wrote a dissertation entitled Imago Romae, Renaissance Visions of the Eternal City. So she's come to the right place here. She is a fellow of the American Academy in Rome and has published essays in both English and in Italian on Leonardo Buffalini and his plan of Rome. In press right now, she has essays for Mario Bevilacqua's volume on early modern plans of Rome and another in Alan Sien's volume on Giovanni Battista Nolli. She is now, I can say with some pride, an instructor of art history in our department at the University of Oregon, and I've had the distinct pleasure of co-teaching a course on Vasi's Rome with her this term. Today, Jessica will speak on Giuseppe Vasi as cartographer, influence and innovation in early modern maps of Rome.
Thank you, Jamie. I have had the pleasure of being here not only for the symposium, but this entire term and this entire year. And I have to say that the graciousness with which you've welcomed all the symposium guests and everyone else is something that maybe you all don't realize, but it is constant, right? It's not just for a special occasion like this. And so I've been very lucky to be here. And obviously, for my own interest, to arrive here just in time for the Vasi show was remarkably serendipitous. And I know, of course, I've known Jim Tice's website on Yoli for quite some time and admired it and used it with great opportunistic glee whenever I could. And of course, Alan I've known a long time. And so this is, I want to thank both Jim and Jamie for not only the remarkable exhibition, and I think a lot has been said and should be said in honor of it, but also for the hospitality and for organizing this particular occasion, which I think is really, to me, quite special. So I'm delighted to be here, despite the fact that I'm also a little bit of a carpetbagger in the sense that I am really a 16th century person, and this was a wonderful invitation for me to dip my toe into a map and talk about a contrast, right? So a very hard act to follow, from Piranesi's glorious Campo Marzio, not to mention Heather Hyde Minor, but down to a work that is not all that well regarded, and in part that was the challenge and why I wanted to work on it. It is upstairs, and I think that perhaps in a mini break you can go look at it and think about, hopefully, some of the ideas I put out there now. So I'll begin. Giuseppe Vasi's 1781 map of Rome is perhaps the least appreciated of his extensive output of etchings. In part, this has to do with its technical shortcomings. Executed near the end of Vasi's life, the map is the work of a master printmaker no longer at the height of his powers. Vasi's strengths as an artist, moreover, lay not in cartography, but rather in evocative pictorial imagery. As epitomized by the vedute that comprise his Magnificenze di Roma, and of course by his dazzling panorama or prospetto of Rome, where those works testify to Vasi's personal observation of the city and its parks, an empiricism that he advertised by including the occasional self-referential draftsman such as this one in the foreground of his prospecto. The 1781 map was neither personally observed nor particularly original. Instead, much of its information was borrowed from other maps. Vasi, in this sense, failed to contribute anything new to the cartography of Rome. Even worse, he relied on models that were entirely outdated. His map then suffered deficiencies of form and content. It was not only shoddy, but also derivative and obsolete from the moment it emerged from the printing press. This is the challenge I've taken. For all of these reasons, it has become something of an embarrassing footnote to an otherwise impressive career and list of accomplishments. In this talk, I will re-examine Vasi's map, not to argue that it should be elevated to a lofty stature among images of Rome, but rather to demonstrate that this outwardly retrograde foray into cartography in fact grants significant insight into the practice of map-making in early modern Europe, as well as Roman Settecento culture, and Vasi's own artistic proclivities. True, it is not his finest moment when it comes to craftsmanship, and I won't claim otherwise, nor will I try to establish Vasi as an unsung hero in the mapping of the Eternal City. But I do believe we can partially rehabilitate this map by examining it through the right lens. Our current notions of accuracy and originality can be ill-fitting when it comes to early modern cartography, which operated according to different standards and reflected different goals than modern maps. The first step toward a reevaluation of Vasi's map is an examination of its relationship to its predecessors. The proverbial elephant in the room in any discussion of Vasi's map, indeed the benchmark by which all 18th century maps of Rome are measured, is of course Giambattista Noli's monumental plan of 1748. Vasi's map pales before this work in size as in many other respects. Noli's work, of course also on display upstairs, was published 3 decades before Vasi's, and it was revolutionary. It established new standards of accuracy and thoroughness that remain unsurpassed till modern times, and it is considered the first scientific rendering of Rome. Noli's map is an iconographic plan, not unlike, of course, Piranesi's Campo Marzio, in which architectural features and the urban infrastructure are reduced to a single horizontal slice of the city, a minutely detailed footprint that conveys dimensions, proportions, and orientations to scale with the utmost clarity. Noli had personally surveyed every stretch of city wall, street, palazzo, church, every curve of the Tiber. By contrast, Vasi probably did not touch a surveyor's compass or measuring chain. His mapping procedure involved selective borrowing from existing sources. But in fact, it was quite common in the 18th century that mapmaking involved compilation more than original cartography. Vasi was simply engaging in an established, generally accepted practice. The early modern representation of Rome is rife with examples. And here I'll start to stick in a little bit of my own early modern knowledge. In the 1480s, Francesco Rosselli published the first printed image of Rome, an enormous engraved city view. That work does not survive, but it was the inspiration for a string of subsequent versions that reflected the same prototype. From Jacopo Filippo Foresti's small illustration in his World Chronicle of 1486, to this double-page woodcut from the Nuremberg Chronicle of 1493, to this painting in the Palazzo Ducale in Mantua of circa 1538 with some updates, to this 1550 version from Sebastian Münster's Cosmography, to Giulio Ballino in 1569, now showing a thoroughly outdated picture of Rome. And I skipped some. This kind of lasting, influential prototype map, which I term an alpha map, comes around once every couple of decades. Others include my personal favorite, Leonardo Buffalini's plan of 1551, Antonio Tempesta's bird's eye view of 1593, Matteo Greuter, 1618, and actually I lied, this one's my favorite, Giovanni Battista Falda of 1676. All of these originated a string of derivatives. This was a time when our modern notions of plagiarism and intellectual property were inchoate at best, and copyright production, in the form of printing privileges, limited and often unenforced. And derivatives of alpha maps were not necessarily unoriginal. To be sure, there were plenty of slavish copies, but there are instances in which later authors revised, critiqued, or somehow advanced beyond the model. A case in point would be Falda's map of 1676, which used Greuter's of 1618 as a point of departure, but is still considered innovative. This, then, is the copying or perhaps collaborative tradition of early modern cartographic culture into which we should insert Vasi's map. It was not unusual that he looked to models, and it is not necessarily grounds for criticism. More problematic is what models he looked to. He studiously ignored Noli's radical innovation, now 30 years old. Vasi's map is not a pure plan like Noli's, but rather a hybrid form that had been popular for centuries, which combined a footprint of the urban infrastructure, namely the paths of the walls, streets, and the like, with a perspective rendering of the built environment. This kind of composite map walks a middle line between the evocative potential of a pictorial treatment and an iconographic plan's emphasis on measurable quantities like distances and orientations. It is part diagram, part picture. So Vasi chose not to emulate Noli's pure plan, and he even dispensed with the orientation to north that Noli had established as standard. Instead, Vasi returned to the bygone convention of orienting maps of Rome with north at the upper left. And for the basic form and geographical armature of his map, he was looking back over a century to Falda's plan of 1676. Also upstairs. Note that the city walls in Vasi's map, to cite the most obvious example, follow basically the same outline as Falda's. But why would Vasi forego the innovations of Noli entirely in favor of Falda's now time-worn prototype? We must assume that Vasi's use of anachronistic models was deliberate, and his rationale merits consideration. A clue comes from the differences between Vasi's map and Falda's. Falda, like his own main predecessor, Greuter, showed Rome entirely disconnected from its extramural surroundings. In both of these images, the city appears to levitate like a cutout, self-contained, wholly independent from the surrounding Campagna and world at large. Many other maps affected the same urban extraction. The Great Tempesta map of 1593 is perhaps the most flagrant example, setting the tone for later images like Falda's. Vasi, by contrast, contextualizes the city, embedding it in a larger setting. The walls still delineate the city from its surroundings, forming an important threshold. The defensive circuit was, after all, the primary marker of urban identity in the early modern period. But its cleaving powers are muted here by the visual interconnection of infra and extramural. For example, the vast green belt of the disabitato within the walls shows little differentiation from the pasture lands outside the gates. The contrast between inside and outside is minimized through a similar density and type of etching.